sponsors for this Congressional Medal of Honor. I thank Senator Cornyn for his work on this. And, Mr. President, I yield.
President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I want to turn the compliment around and extend my appreciation to Senator from Ohio, Senator Brown, for his leadership on this issue. This is long overdue to these great American patriots, the recognition that they so justly earned. And, Mr. President, turning to another subject, I'd ask unanimous consent that Jason Church, a military fellow in Senator Ron Johnson's office, be granted floor privileges for the duration of the consideration of S. 1197, the National Defense Authorization Act.
Without objection.
Mr. President, 4 years ago, an Islamic radical who identified with al-Qaeda and supported the cause of global jihad opened fire at Fort Hood Army Base in Killeen, Texas. The shooter eventually killed 12 soldiers and 1 civilian, while wounding 30 others. He might have killed and wounded many more, but for the selflessness of a civilian physician's assistant by the name of Michael Cahill and an Army captain named John Gaffney, both of whom charged the gunman and gave their lives in order to save the lives of others. 4 years later, we continue to honor the tremendous sacrifice, their tremendous sacrifice, and we continue to honor the memories of all those who gave their lives or were injured on that awful day. Back in August, the Fort Worth shooter was sentenced to death for his crime, and appropriately so. Let me be clear about what the nature of this crime was. This was not an ordinary criminal event. This was a terrorist attack, plain and simple, committed by a man who had reportedly had at least 20 different email communications with a senior al-Qaeda figure by the name of Anwar al-Awlaki. The late Mr. Awlaki, who was killed by a U.S. drone strike in September 2011, also had contacts, well documented, with the so-called underwear bomber who tried to blow up Northwest Airlines Flight 253 just 7 weeks after the massacre at Fort Hood. Following the Fort Hood attack, Awlaki celebrated the shooter as a hero, he called him, a hero. He also told Al Jazeera that prior to the attack, the gunman had specifically asked him whether Islamic law justified, quote, killing U.S. soldiers and officers, close quote. The Fort Hood shooter had repeatedly and unapologetically said that his terrible atrocities, which included execution-style murders, were just part of a larger jihad against the West, which is why he shouted, Allah Akbar, just before opening fire. The shooter has said that by slaughtering 13 Americans, including 12 uniformed military members and 1 civilian, he said he was defending the Islamic Empire and helping my Muslim brothers. In short, the Fort Hood massacre was not an episode of workplace violence. This was a terrorist attack inspired by terrorist propaganda and carried out by someone who was an agent of al-Qaeda and viewed himself as an al-Qaeda holy warrior. Unfortunately, the United States government so far has refused to give the kind of recognition that is deserved to the 12 uniformed service members who gave their life and those who were injured on that terrible day. Part of that recognition should include Purple Hearts to the soldiers who lost their lives and not given the civilian equivalent, the Medal for the Defense of Freedom to Michael Cahill. In other words, so far, the United States government, its official position is this is not a terrorist attack on our own soil, but so far the position of the federal government is that this is an ordinary criminal attack. Mr. President, that cannot stand. We cannot denigrate the service of those military members who lost their lives that day and this civilian hero, Michael Cahill, who lost his life, by saying that this is somehow workplace violence or just some ordinary criminal attack. We need to recognize officially that this was a terrorist attack inspired by an agent of al-Qaeda, carried out by another agent of al-Qaeda on our own soil. Now, some will tell you that Purple Hearts can be awarded to victims of a terrorist attack only if the perpetrators of that attack were acting under the direction of a foreign terrorist organization. And in their view, the Fort Hood shooter doesn't qualify. Well, this argument fails to take into account the evolving nature of the conflict, the global war on terrorism. After all, al-Qaeda leader al-Zawahiri has urged his followers to conduct exactly the kind of deadly attacks that occurred at Fort Hood in 2009 and then at the Boston Marathon in 2013. Zawahiri believes that such, quote, dispersed, close quote, small-scale attacks will, quote, keep America in a state of tension and anticipation, close quote. As he declared a few months ago, he said these dispersed attacks can be carried out by one brother or a small number of brothers. In other words, it doesn't make any sense to distinguish so-called lone wolf terrorists acting on behalf of al-Qaeda from other terrorists with a more explicit al-Qaeda affiliation. Remember, al-Qaeda doesn't issue business cards or calling cards, and it doesn't issue its staff IDs. What it does do is urge Islamic radicals around the world to pick up arms and kill Americans. And that's what Major Hassan did that terrible day 4 years ago at Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas. For that matter, al-Qaeda views American soil as the primary battleground in its war against Western civilization. When courageous members of our military lose their lives to al-Qaeda-inspired terrorists, whether it's abroad or here at home, they deserve to receive Purple Hearts, and their grieving families deserve to receive the proper benefits accorded to all men and women in our military who lose their lives in service to their country. It shouldn't matter whether they lose their lives in America, whether it's in New York on 9/11, Killeen, Texas 4 years ago, or whether it's on the battlefield in Afghanistan. It shouldn't make any difference when they lose their life as part of the effort to protect innocent life in the war on terrorism. If they're killed by a terrorist committing violence on behalf of foreign jihadists, then they are casualties of the broader war on terrorism, and they deserve to be treated as such. Earlier this year, I introduced legislation that would make the Fort Hood victims eligible for all of the honors and benefits available to their fellow U.S. service members serving overseas in combat zones. My co-sponsors in the House are Representatives Carter and Williams, and they have numerous co-sponsors in the House. And today I'm offering a modified version of that legislation as an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill. By enacting this amendment, Congress would honor the memories of those who lost their lives at Fort Hood, and it would help their surviving family members, all of whom, as you can imagine, have experienced tremendous pain and hardship as a result of this terrorist act on our own soil 4 years ago at Fort Hood, Killeen, Texas, at the hand of Major Nidal Hassan, an agent of al-Qaeda to be sure, and someone who deserves the penalty of death that's been meted out by a military jury just a few weeks ago. Mr. President, I hope that the Senate will rise up in a bipartisan way and pass this important legislation and erase these meaningless distinctions which differentiate between those who lose their lives in Afghanistan and those who lose their lives here on American soil. It's a just and well-deserved honor that these patriots have earned by their own blood, and these families deserve as a way of ameliorating some of the terrible loss that they have suffered in their own service to our country. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to discuss the legislation before us, the National Defense Authorization Act, and to highlight some of the many provisions in this legislation that are critical as we think about our national security and the future of our military. I chair the Readiness Subcommittee, and I understand that one of the chief challenges that faces our military is readiness. The effects of nearly 10 years of warfare on our equipment and personnel, coupled with the sharp budget reductions under sequestration, have made it more difficult for our nation's military leaders to prepare our forces for combat. During our markup of the Readiness Subcommittee sections of this bill, I was pleased to work with my colleague from New Hampshire, the ranking member of the Readiness Subcommittee, Senator Ayotte, to move more than $1.5 billion from low-priority military construction projects into critical operations and maintenance accounts for each of our military services. This move will help mitigate the worst effects of sequestration on readiness. It obviously isn't going to address the whole problem. We've got a lot more work to do. But our men and women in uniform put their lives on the line for us. And we need to keep the commitment that we have made that they should have the best possible training and best available equipment before we send them into combat. I was also pleased to work with Senators McCain, Leahy, and Grassley to include a one-year extension of the special immigrant visa programs for both Iraq and Afghanistan. Special immigrant visas allow Afghans and Iraqis who worked directly for the United States government, work directly with our men and women on the ground. It helps them come to the United States if their lives are in danger as the result of their service. We've heard countless stories of how these brave men and women risk their lives to help our men and women, to help drive out violent extremists from their home countries of Iraq and Afghanistan. And as we wind down our military operations, we have a responsibility to ensure that those who are in danger as a result of their faithful service to the United States, to make sure that they are protected from harm. Many of us are now familiar with one of these stories that has been much publicized, the story of U.S. soldier Matt Zeller and his Afghan interpreter, Janice Shinwari, who served the United States government for over 9 years in Afghanistan. During an attack in 2009, Shinwari not only pulled Zeller out of a kill zone to safety, he also shot 2 members of the Taliban who were sneaking up behind them. In doing that, he saved Zeller's life. Following the incident, Shinwari was put on a Taliban kill list. After many months and really years of waiting, both Zeller and Shinwari recently reunited here in the United States thanks to this special immigrant visa program. I had the opportunity with Senator McCain to meet with the 2 of them in my office several weeks ago. To hear Matt Zeller say that Janice Shinwari is his brother and how grateful he is for saving Zeller's life, but also for all of the other members of his unit who were helped by Shinwari. These stories are incredibly common, and I'm grateful to all of our colleagues here for their assistance in reauthorizing this program, not just through the NDAA bill that's before us, but the short-term extension that we were able to get during the government shutdown by unanimous consent in both the Senate and the House. It shows just how much we appreciate in America the service that these men and women from Iraq and Afghanistan have given to us. The bill before us also includes provisions from the Next Generation Cooperative Threat Reduction Act, which I introduced earlier this year. The Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Act is the most successful non-proliferation program in our country's history, and the language in the underlying bill would expand the scope of non-Lugar to reflect the current security environment. Specifically, the bill requires the President to develop a comprehensive strategy to address the rapidly growing threat of proliferation across the Middle East and North Africa. The spread of nuclear weapons is one of the gravest threats we face, both in the United States and across the international community. We need to ensure that our efforts to combat those challenges are coordinated and that they reflect where the current security challenges really exist. I'm also pleased that we were able to increase funding in this bill for the Department of Defense's Inspectors General by $35 million. And this is important because investment in our nation's Inspectors General continues to be one of the most cost-effective things the government can do, particularly when it concerns the Department of Defense. In 2012, DoD Inspectors General saved taxpayers more than $3.6 billion, and IGFers have been credited with a nearly $11 return on investment for every dollar spent. And as the presiding officer knows, given our ongoing fiscal challenges, it is now more important than ever before that we ensure that every dollar is spent effectively. Finally, Mr. President, I want to address the issue of military sexual assault that is tackled in this NDAA Defense Act, because it makes significant progress towards addressing the crisis of sexual assault in our nation's military. I commend all of the members of the Armed Services Committee who worked so tirelessly to address this issue, but I want to particularly call out Senators McCaskill and Gillibrand, who have really led the charge and worked to help ensure that we include provisions in this Act that can address this scourge on our military. Because of their leadership, we're going to pass a bill that will take historic steps towards addressing this problem. And while, as you and I know, we may have had different ideas about the best way to address the problem, we are united in our commitment to victims of sexual assault, and we will keep fighting for them. Now, I certainly look forward to supporting the Gillibrand Amendment, the Military Justice Improvement Act, along with the presiding officer, because it addresses chain of command issues that I believe can cause victims of sexual assault in the military to refrain from reporting an incident because they fear either that nothing will be done or that there will be retaliation from their commanders. But regardless of the outcome of that legislation, it is important to reflect on the provisions that are already included in this bill, because the bill before us today includes nearly 30 provisions that address sexual assault, prevention, investigation, and prosecution procedures at the Department of Defense. Almost all of these provisions were agreed to unanimously in the Armed Services Committee. Strong bipartisan support for common sense sexual assault prevention reforms like those included in this bill sends a powerful message to all of the members of our military, including tens of thousands of victims, many of whom have been suffering quietly for decades, that what happened to them is unacceptable and it will no longer be tolerated. One of the critical challenges we face in the military is changing the culture surrounding sexual assault. I was pleased to work with our colleagues to include provisions in the bill to help create an environment where victims can feel safe to come forward and report these crimes. And in any organization, the best way to attract the most qualified personnel is to tie an issue to career advancement. Sexual assault prevention and response is no different. That's why Senator Fisher and I included language that elevates the role of sexual assault prevention response officers to ensure that we have the highest caliber candidates assigned to those positions. Also, in recent months, I've held roundtable discussions with New Hampshire law enforcement officers, with members of our University of New Hampshire community who have worked on sexual assault prevention, and with members of the New Hampshire National Guard to discuss their best practices, the way in which they're working together in New Hampshire to address domestic violence and sexual assault. As the result of some of those discussions, we have included in the bill a reform that would require the Defense Department to incorporate civilian sexual assault investigation and prosecution best practices into their military procedures. I want to close this afternoon by thanking Chairman Levin and Ranking Member Inhofe for their leadership on this bipartisan bill. We still have a lot of work to do here in the Senate, but obviously the foundation has been laid by the work of the committee and by their leadership. I also want to thank my staff for their incredibly hard work and dedication, the staff of all of the Armed Services Committee, because without their contributions we would not have made as much progress as we did. From the Readiness Subcommittee, Jay Maroney, John Quirk, and Mike Noblett on the majority side, Lucian Niemeyer, Bill Castle, and Bruce Hawk from the minority. And from my personal staff, Chad Crackmeyer, Josh Lucas, Joel Colony, and Patrick Day. And finally, I want to say a special thank you to Commander Tasha Lacey. Tasha is a graduate of the Naval Academy, and she served in my office over the past year as a fellow on loan from the Department of the Navy. Her thoughtfulness and insight has been invaluable on a wide range of issues, especially during our efforts to address sexual assault. She's headed back to the Navy soon, but I wanted her to know that it truly has been a pleasure having her on my staff, and I wish her good luck in her next assignment. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I hope we can come together in the next couple of days and get this bill done. I yield the floor and note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and the senators who've been managing the debate for the Defense Programs Bill spoke on the floor a short while ago. No agreement was reached on how to move forward with the defense bill or whether to hold votes on a couple of proposals dealing with sexual assaults in the military. We've been hearing debate in the Senate on sexual assault since about 10:40 Eastern Time this morning.
Senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that proceedings under the call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'm very pleased to be here on the Senate floor with my friend and colleague from Minnesota, Senator Klobuchar, as we introduce an important resolution. This month, Mr. President, is National Alzheimer's Awareness Month. Alzheimer's is a terrible disease that exacts a tremendous personal and economic toll on both the individual and the family. Like many families, mine has experienced the pain of Alzheimer's. I know that there is no more helpless feeling than to watch the progression of this devastating disease. It is equally painful to witness the emotional and physical damage inflicted on family caregivers, exhausted by an endless series of 36-hour days. Moreover, Alzheimer's is the only cause of death among the top 10 in our nation without a way to prevent it, to cure it, or even to slow its progression. More than 5 million Americans have Alzheimer's disease, more than double the number in 1980. Based on current projections, as many as 16 million Americans over the age of 65 will have Alzheimer's by the year 2050. In addition to the tremendous human suffering it causes, Alzheimer's costs the United States more than $200 billion a year, including $142 billion in costs to the Medicare and Medicaid programs. This price tag, Mr. President, will increase exponentially as the baby boomer generation ages. If we fail to change the current trajectory of Alzheimer's disease, our country will not only face a mounting public health crisis, but an economic one as well. If nothing is done to slow or stop this disease, the Alzheimer's Association estimates that Alzheimer's will cost our country an astonishing $20 trillion over the next 40 years. It is estimated that nearly 1 in 2 of baby boomers reaching age 85 will develop Alzheimer's. As a consequence, chances are that the members of the baby boom generation will either be spending their golden years suffering from Alzheimer's or caring for someone who has it. In many ways, Alzheimer's has become the defining disease of this generation. If we are to prevent Alzheimer's from becoming the defining disease of the next generation, it is imperative that we dramatically increase our investment in Alzheimer's disease research. According to a study commissioned by the National Institute on Aging, Alzheimer's and other dementias cost the United States more than cancer and heart disease. This study finds that both the costs and number of people with dementia will more than double within 30 years, skyrocketing at a rate that rarely occurs with a chronic disease. At a time when the cost to Medicare and Medicaid of caring for Alzheimer's patients exceeds $140 billion a year, We are spending only slightly more than $500 million on Alzheimer's research, spending $142 billion under Medicare and Medicaid, more than $200 billion overall, and yet only $500 million on research. We currently spend $6 billion a year for cancer research, $3 billion a year for research on HIV/AIDS, and $2 billion for cardiovascular research. And I want to emphasize that those are all worthy investments that have paid dividends in terms of better treatments, cures in some cases, prolonged lives in others. Surely we can do more for Alzheimer's given the tremendous human and economic price of this devastating disease. The national plan to address Alzheimer's disease was authorized by bipartisan law passed in 2010, the National Alzheimer's Project Act, which I authored with then-Senator Evan Bayh. The national plan has as its primary goal to prevent and effectively treat Alzheimer's by the year 2025. The chairman of the Advisory Council on Alzheimer's Research, Care, and Services, which was created by the National Alzheimer's Project Act, has testified before Congress that the United States must devote at least $2 billion a year to Alzheimer's research to achieve that goal. I'm therefore joining with my colleague from Minnesota, Senator Klobuchar, in introducing this resolution declaring that the goal of preventing and effectively treating Alzheimer's by 2025 is an urgent national priority. Our resolution recognizes that dramatic increases in research funding are necessary to meet that goal and resolves that the Senate will strive to double the amount of funding that the United States spends on Alzheimer's research in fiscal year 2015 and then develop a plan to meet the target of $2 billion a year over the next 5 years. Just think of the figures here, Mr. President. We're spending some $212 billion a year caring for people with Alzheimer's. All we're asking is that over the next 5 years, we achieve the goal that the Alzheimer's Council, a council of experts in Alzheimer's, including experts from the Mayo Clinic in Senator Klobuchar's home state, have recommended that we spend $2 billion. $2 billion is such a tiny percentage of the amount that we're spending. So this is a worthy investment. It's one that will not only relieve suffering, save lives potentially, but it will also more than pay for itself. Thank you, Mr. President. I would urge our colleagues to join us as co-sponsors. I would also ask unanimous consent that letters from the Alzheimer's Association and the Us Against Alzheimer's group, both the predominant national advocacy groups, endorsing our resolution be included in the record at the conclusion of my statement. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm very pleased that my colleague, Senator Klobuchar, who's been such a leader in this area, has joined me on the Senate floor, and I would yield the floor to her.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Well, I first would like to thank my colleague, Senator Collins, for her great leadership for so long on this issue. We have together authored this resolution, and she has been a true champion of those suffering from this debilitating disease. Our resolution builds on the legacy of work and research that has been done in America. It declares the prevention and effective treatment of Alzheimer's by 2025 an urgent national priority and calls for enhanced resources necessary to achieve this goal. And there is no better time than now to discuss this critical issue and draw attention to this disease because, as my colleague from Maine noted, November is Alzheimer's Disease Awareness and Family Caregivers Month. President Reagan made this designation back in 1983 to raise awareness about the devastating impacts of Alzheimer's disease on patients and their caregivers. Alzheimer's presents one of the toughest medical, economic, and social challenges of this country. We all know we're seeing a doubling of the senior population in this country. Some call it a silver tsunami. And of course, it's a positive. More and more people are living longer and longer. But we also know that we are seeing more and more people who are living with very difficult diseases, and one of them, in fact, the leading one, is Alzheimer's. This disease takes an incredibly enormous toll, both on patients as well as those who must sit helplessly by and watch as the disease progresses and slowly takes away a loved one. Right now, close to 5.2 million Americans are living with this disease, including nearly 100,000 people in my home state of Minnesota. These numbers will grow dramatically. If we continue on the same trajectory that we are on now, by 2050, an estimated 16 million Americans will be living with this disease. That is an increase, Mr. President, of almost 320% over what we see today. 320% over what we see today. The financial cost of providing care for people afflicted by the disease is staggering for families, for our health care system, and of course for the federal budget. In 2013, we will spend $203 billion caring for individuals with Alzheimer's. Medicare and Medicaid will bear about 70% of these costs. By 2050, we will be paying more than $1.2 trillion to care for people with Alzheimer's. We also know that it's tough on caregivers. They suffer an emotional and physical toll that results in a higher incidence of chronic conditions themselves. In 2012, more than 15 million family members, spouses, children, and friends in the United States provided care to an adult with Alzheimer's. The unpaid care is valued at more than $216 billion. So many of the people, friends of mine, who are involved in this care also have their own children. That's why we call them the sandwich generation. They are literally sandwiched in between caring for their aging parents and caring for a child. Just as the country addressed the needs of working moms and dads in the 1970s, we must now address the needs of working sons and daughters. This is a critical piece of the puzzle in taking on the Alzheimer's challenge. Most importantly, our resolution is about the lives that could be improved with better treatments and cures. Earlier this year, I met with 30 Minnesotans who were here in Washington, D.C., each having been touched by Alzheimer's. I have been at rallies. I have seen those purple shirts in our state. Thousands of people gathered to stay. We want a cure. We want better treatments. We don't want to lose our loved ones like this. One way we can help stem the tide of this devastating disease is through research. As my colleague from Maine mentioned, Mayo Clinic does fine research in this area. They have found ways to identify Alzheimer's earlier through testing. And at first you might say, well, how does that help to get a cure? Well, how are we ever going to know what treatments work best and what a cure is if we can't first identify it at early stages so then we can see improvements? Because if we identify it too late, you're never able to test to see if treatments work. University of Minnesota also doing outstanding research on mice, prize-winning research. Here's the fact of any of these numbers, and we all remember this isn't just about the numbers, it's about the people. But if there's any number to remember, it is this. If we were able to delay the onset of Alzheimer's by just 5 years, we would be able to cut the government spending on Alzheimer's care by almost half in 2050. Almost half. I see Senator Durbin, also a leader in this area, the senator from Illinois, out on the floor. He knows what we're talking about with the budget, the kind of money we're going to need to help our kids, to make our country a better place. Just think of what we could do with that money if we could reduce the spending on this debilitating disease by half by 2050. The answers on Alzheimer's won't just drop from the sky. It will take dedicated scientists, advanced research initiatives, and skilled doctors to conduct the trials and care for as many patients as possible until we finally put an end to the disease. That's what this is about. A friend of mine is in town today, Commissioner Mike Opak from Hennepin County. Hennepin County is the biggest public hospital in Minnesota, and as county attorney, I used to represent that hospital. I know what this means for their budget every single day as people who could have been cured or people who could have had the onset of this disease be delayed have suffered and have been in the hospital and have been on the taxpayer dime. Of course we're going to take care of them, but so many other things could this money be used for. The Advisory Council on Alzheimer's Research, Care and Services, which is led by Dr. Ronald Peterson, a Minnesotan and a leading researcher on Alzheimer's, has acknowledged that in order to reach the goal of effectively treating Alzheimer's disease by 2025, our country must invest $2 billion per year. Sounds like a lot of money, but not with these other figures I just put out there, right? At $1.2 trillion in treatment, doubling of the number of seniors that we're seeing by 2030, $2 billion per year. That's why Senator Collins and I have joined together to introduce this resolution, which resolves that the Senate will strive to double the funding the United States spends on Alzheimer's research in 2015 and develop a plan to meet the target of $2 billion a year over the next 5 years. Today, we spend approximately $500 million per year on Alzheimer's, as noted by my colleague. So we have a long way to go to meet this goal. It is not easy, but in the long term, it will save us money, it will save lives, and it will make for a better world for literally millions of people in this country and around the world. I urge my colleagues to join Senator Collins and me in supporting this important resolution. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I want to thank my colleagues, Senator Collins of Maine, Senator Klobuchar of Minnesota, for bringing this issue of Alzheimer's before the Senate for consideration with this resolution. I ask unanimous consent to be added as a co-sponsor to the resolution that they've introduced.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I might also add that yesterday I introduced a resolution on the same subject and was happy to have Senator Collins as a co-sponsor along with several other colleagues who have joined me. They include Senators Mikulski, Tim Johnson, Menendez, Wicker, Moran, and Markey. The goal, I won't go through all of the important statistics that have been related during this floor presentation by my colleagues, but our goal is to make sure that the national plan, which is being developed to address Alzheimer's, is carried out. We want to reinforce the initial steps toward greater investment in finding answers. I think everyone is on that same track. And we believe that supporting the goals and implementation of the National Alzheimer's Project Act and the National Plan to Address Alzheimer's Disease is the right course to follow. Achieving these goals means federal funding must be there to implement it. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan resolution and reinforce our national commitment to turning around the seeming inevitability of this terrible, terrible disease. I look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure investments are made in Alzheimer's research. And, Mr. President, let me just say parenthetically, if you think that we can sequester funds for the National Institute of Health and honestly deal with the challenge of Alzheimer's, you're wrong. You can't cut funding at the National Institutes of Health in the name of sequestration. Cutting grants that could find breakthrough cures for many diseases, you can't cut those funds and discourage researchers from even participating in future research and expect to solve the medical challenges that face us, including Alzheimer's. I'm urging my colleagues to look at this not as just a matter of resolutions, which are important, but also funding, which is critical, so that we can find the solutions to these problems in a manner that is reasonable and quickly done. Mr. President, I want to, before I give a statement on another topic, I would like to note that we continue to focus on the damage that was caused last Sunday by deadly tornadoes and storms in Illinois, estimated to have exceeded $1 billion in cost. We have seen some scenes from that wreckage in places like Washington, Illinois, the hardest hit in our state. They experienced an EF4 tornado, wind speeds close to 200 miles an hour. I can recall one news report where a man went home and couldn't find his SUV, an indication of the ferocity and intensity of the winds that wiped a swath of devastation through this great town in central Illinois. Power lines are still down and there are gas leaks. There's still danger there, but the first responders were there. The obvious helpers, Red Cross and Salvation Army, are on the scene. The federal, state, and local agencies are pitching in. And equally important, I spoke to the mayor, the people are pitching in. Those who survived it are helping those who've had the most damage, finding them a place to sleep, making sure they have enough to eat, trying to put their lives back together and go through the salvage and recover the important things to their families. The F-4 that tore through Washington was one of two that touched down in my state that day. The other, which struck New Minden, which is down near the Metro East St. Louis area, caused unbelievable damage. All told, 84 tornadoes were reported throughout the Midwest on Sunday. We know more about the people whose lives were lost in this terrible event. 3 died in Massac County, deep southern Illinois. Kathy George, 58 years old, a devoted wife and mother. Robert Harmon, an avid motorcyclist. Scalita Burris, who was excited to visit her son for Thanksgiving. In Washington County, brother and sister, Joseph and Frances Hoy, died in a tornado. They lived together on a farm near New Minden. Joseph Hoy was president of the Midwest Bird and Animal Breeders Association. In Tazewell County, Steve Neubauer of Washington. He was a mechanic and often helped his neighbors repair their tractors and lawnmowers. My thoughts and prayers are with their families and friends. It's bad enough to lose your home, but to lose someone you love is just irreplaceable. I want them to know that we're thinking of them at this moment. There's a lot more to do. We've got to pitch in and help the communities that have been so heavily hit. I said before and I'll say again, there are certain things that come through these disasters that are inspiring. I know a year from now we'll go back to these neighborhoods and marvel at the progress that's been made as people rebuild their homes and their lives and their playgrounds and their churches and their schools. They don't quit. They don't give up. And secondly, we will have a litany of examples of people who reached out and helped others in a selfless, caring, compassionate way. As I said, it's not unique to Illinois. It's not unique to the Midwest, maybe not even unique to America. But each time we go through one of these tests, it warms your heart to know that people do respond so well to help one another. We're going to continue to keep in touch with the governor. Local officials provide the federal assistance on a bipartisan basis that will help these communities and families get their lives back together. And now, Mr. President, I ask consent that the following statement be placed in a separate part in the record from my previous statements.
Without objection.
Mr. President, you know better than most what it means for someone to enter our military, to raise their hand and take an oath in service of the United States. It is the giving of their time and their lives. Equally important, they are risking their lives. They know that they can be called on in that capacity to defend this country. They can be injured, they can lose their lives in the defense of this nation, and many have. But they still do it on a voluntary and selfless basis. We realize that for most of them, they view their threats as the enemy that is going to attack the United States or their units. But we've come to learn that there are other enemies within the military which are equally troublesome and worrisome. It is one thing to have a son or a daughter or someone you love very much take an oath to serve in the military and run the risk of a dangerous encounter with an enemy. But it is absolutely unacceptable to think that these men and women in the military would run the risk of a dangerous attack by someone else in the military on them. I'm speaking to the issue of sexual assault. It's one which is topical because we have finally started to come to grips with the reality of what it means. Our responsibility is to ensure that the men and women in the military have everything they need. Sexual assault threatens it. It erodes the basic trust, respect, and professionalism that our troops uphold and rely on to perform their duties. In a more fundamental sense, it also cuts to the heart of basic questions of safety, dignity, and justice as Americans. However we measure it, the current system has failed our service members. The evidence is overwhelming. 26,000 total incidents that have been estimated occurred of sexual assault in the military in a recent year. Only 3,400 reports were made from victims. The Institute of Medicine estimates 21.5% of active duty women and literally thousands of active duty men have been sexually assaulted. We also know that 60% of the victims who do report these sexual assaults say they are retaliated against for doing so. 60%. Overwhelming majorities of victims say they often don't report an incident because they don't think it'll make any difference. It is a sweeping and comprehensive indictment of the current system. I have a responsibility as chairman of the Defense Appropriations Committee to work more closely with members of the military and their leaders than ever before. I've come to know them, to like them, to respect them. And when they tell me, as they all have to a person, that they are doing everything conceivable to deal with this problem, I believe them. But I also believe that there are elements within the culture of some parts of our military which are almost intractable and have to be dealt with in a new and more definitive way. Let me share one example that came to light recently. I attended a Freedom Salute ceremony for an Illinois National Guard unit that recently returned from Theater Gateway operations in Kuwait. They'd been gone a year. It was a small unit, fewer than 20, but they came home and their families were with them, and they were out at Camp Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois. This unit was in charge of transportation, making sure that 100,000 service members who came through that theater had what they needed to make it to their next destination and ultimately back home. Some of these people were being redeployed, don't get me wrong, but many were headed home. Among the service members, I heard from these members of this unit, among the service members they helped move through this hub was a young woman who had been sexually assaulted somewhere in the region. Theirs wasn't the first stop. The first stop for this sexual assault victim was a barracks situation where she literally had to walk through the men's restroom facilities to go to the women's restroom facilities. This is a victim of sexual assault. She told us, the person I spoke to in the unit, that this victim said to her that these were the first sympathetic faces that she'd seen or worked with since this terrible incident. And she was grateful for this Illinois Guard unit for standing by her in this emotionally trying time. I was happy to hear that this Guard unit had stepped up to give this young woman the help that she needed. But it is inexcusable, in fact it's shameful, that the rest of the system failed her. It is a story repeated too many times across the services. This current system has to change, and it will. I want to thank for their extraordinary advocacy Senator Claire McCaskill of Missouri, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, and Senator Patty Murray of Washington, and many, many others. They have put into the pending bill on the Defense Authorization Act many effective and necessary reforms. I supported them, and I appreciate Chairman Levin and Ranking Member Senator Inhofe for including 26 reforms in the underlying Defense Authorization bill. I want to highlight one reform in particular that I played a small part in, the Special Victims Councils. I want to highlight this reform because victims need and deserve someone in their corner helping them through what is probably one of the toughest moments of their lives. In testimony earlier this year in the Defense Appropriations Committee, which I chair, the head of the Air Force, General Welsh, talked about how effective this pilot program of Special Victims Councils has been. The bill that is pending before us would expand their services, and my subcommittee's appropriation mark, spending mark, ensures that it will be fully funded. The bill's other reforms are equally powerful: improving prevention, holding leaders accountable for the climate in the military on this issue, reforming the Military Justice Code. On these reforms, there is strong bipartisan agreement. Many of these reforms, including the one that we may vote on before we leave this week, are thanks to the leadership of Senator Claire McCaskill. She has been relentless in her efforts to lead on this important issue. And today is no different. She has an amendment, which she offered, which empowers the victims of sexual assault to have a greater voice in how their case is prosecuted. It would require commanders' promotion reviews to take sexual assault climate into account. and it would eliminate the so-called good soldier defense, by which commanders are permitted to consider the defendant's overall value to the unit. I really appreciate Senator McCaskill's leadership on this issue, and I think that her amendment is a positive one. The crux of today's floor debate is whether or not the Senate pushes this reform even further. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York offers an amendment that aims to give victims greater confidence that the military justice system is free from any bias by giving the decision on these cases to a senior judge advocate general outside the victim's chain of command. However, we come down on this proposal, we all know this would be a significant change for a military justice code that has only undergone 2 significant changes since 1950. But I believe we must go forward with the Gillibrand proposal, and I will vote in favor of her proposal. I didn't come to this decision lightly. I've discussed this issue with my colleagues in the Senate, as well as every single military leader that they have recommended I meet with. I've met with them publicly and privately. I've listened carefully, and I've called the victims to hear their side as well. I considered the views of outside experts as well as my colleagues. Many of my colleagues have served in the military, and they have personal insights. After much deliberation, I've concluded that every single one of these reforms, including Senator Gillibrand's proposal, is going to be necessary if we are to give victims the confidence they need and the support they need to come forward. I would also note that Senator Gillibrand's effort is endorsed by a diverse and thoughtful range of outside groups. They include the National Women's Law Center, the Vietnam Veterans of America, the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services, and the Service Women's Action Network. Mr. President, I know our senior military leaders are committed to cracking down on sexual assault. Many commanders around the world are just as outraged as Congress and just as committed to prosecuting offenders and setting a new tone in the military. But it is Congress' role to ensure that the system those leaders implement is fair and reasonable. It must put the victims of assault back in control and the perpetrators of these crimes on notice. It must restore victims' confidence. These reforms accomplish this goal, and I look forward to supporting them. Mr. President, at this point I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Senator Durbin continuing nearly 6 hours of debate today on proposals dealing with sexual assault in the military. This afternoon, Majority Leader Harry Reid tried to set up votes for this evening on amendments from Senators Gillibrand and McCaskill. But Senators Inhofe and Coburn objected because they want to be able to have additional votes on other amendments, which is not possible because Senator Reid used a procedure called filling the amendment tree earlier this week. Senator Reid has said that there is not enough time on the Senate calendar to consider amendments to the Defense Programs Bill. And that amendment from Senator Gillibrand would take military sexual assault cases outside the chain of command. She says that's necessary to encourage military personnel to report assaults. Senator McCaskill's amendment would keep the military chain of command and, among other things, require new special victims counselors trained to handle sexual assault cases to advise victims of the advantages and disadvantages of their case being prosecuted in civilian or military justice systems. Also wanted to mention some of our live coverage here on C-SPAN 2 tonight. The 2013 National Book Awards is being held in New York, and we're going to see Maya Angelou receive an award, and also the presentations of the awards for nonfiction, fiction, poetry, and young people's literature. Our live book TV coverage gets underway at 7:40 Eastern and again tonight at 9. And if you'd like to see some of the red carpet arrivals at the event, we'll have that book TV at booktv.org starting at 6 Eastern. And here's some of the debate from earlier today on sexual assaults in the military, starting with Senator Kelly Ayotte, who has her own proposal on the issue.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to talk about a very important issue that I spoke about on the floor yesterday, and that is eliminating sexual assaults in our military, making sure that victims are supported, that they get the support that they need. And yesterday on the floor I talked about important reforms that we are doing together on a bipartisan basis to make sure that victims receive special victims counsel. So each victim is now going to receive an attorney that represents him or her in the system and stands up for their rights, making retaliation a crime under the Uniform Military Code of Justice so that victims of sexual assault understand that they will, if they are retaliated against, that there will be a crime for that. And in fact, those who retaliate will be brought to justice. And the many other of dozens of reforms that are in the defense authorization. But today I want to talk about a very important issue. And I see on the floor Senator McCaskill, who I believe I want to commend her for her leadership on this issue. She's been a tremendous leader. Senator McCaskill, Senator Fisher from Nebraska, and myself have introduced an amendment that will further strengthen the historic reforms that we discussed yesterday on the defense authorization, including having in it allowing a victim to formally express their wish about how their case will be handled, in addition to their being, of course, provided special victims counsel, to provide the prosecuting attorney the ability to disagree with the commander's decision, which I will talk about more, and to have a review of that decision by the civilian head of each force, and then to eliminate things like the good soldier defense. And then those who feel like they have been discharged from the military or how their discharge has been described will now get an opportunity to have their case reviewed. So we're not